our great weekend of research talks. So I was thinking about everything the three of you were talking about, and I feel like there were a lot of themes throughout all your work. So we were looking at archives, we were talking about counter-narratives, we were talking about sort of reclaiming histories and historiography. And also, as well, one thing is that all of you have worked not only as scholars who have produced research, but have also worked in a variety of other areas. Julian, you've curated museum exhibits, and Laura, you've done children's books, and Rachel, you've done comics and graphic novels, and I'm sure I'm missing other many accomplishments. So my first question was just about that sort of nature of your many roles that you fulfill. So how do you feel that your roles as artists, as creatives, as scholars and consumers have spoken to each other, inspired the work you've done?
I don't know how you're looking at me.
I really want to you're at the end of the table,
right?
Yeah.
That's a good question, actually. Academia is a particular place around the idea of interdisciplinarity, right? They say they love it, but then when you do it, it gets really complicated. I've given a lot of talks because I'm like an old man now, and I'm an old professor by far, and I am in some of those talks I really literally describe myself as like a confused mess, right? Because I'm a historian who currently lives in the history department. I wrote my dissertation about city planning, and now I write about comics and Afrofuturism and digital humanities. And people are like, how did that work? And I'm like, okay, there's an actual legitimate path that involves like understanding that multiple kinds of perspectives on a thing. Like a plan is basically, the plans I worked on were basically artistic objects in the early 20th century. If you ever read a city plan of the early 20th century, it's basically an artistic work. It's paintings, drawings, a lot of photography is involved, a lot of public art actually is involved in the movement. So like when I was writing about it, I was like, well, these people are just, they're art. Like they're using art, they have like a whole belief about art as a transformative force, and so I'm like, oh, okay. So that is part of the challenge, right? On the one hand, the disciplinary legacy that you're brought up in, for lack of a better term, has certain expectations, but as you, I think, realize the opportunities that come from being in dialogue with other perspectives, it opens you up. And like you have a choice. Sometimes it has to do with the institution that you're at. I mean, quite frankly, I have the career that I have because I started out at a small liberal arts college. They didn't care what I did as long as I did something, right? Like literally, they were like, you can do whatever you want, but you got to teach these classes, right? Like, you know, you just got to publish something, whatever. They were super lax. And so I was like, okay. And then at some point they were like, wait, you seem really well known for this. Like, yeah. Like it's caught on. But, you know, if I had been at a bigger state institution where they hire you to be X, I don't know if I would have had the time to be Y. So at some level, recognizing the opportunity, having the space to realize, to pursue those opportunities is a huge part of it for me personally. And so I'm always really sensitive to people going like, I want to do something a little bit different. I'm like, okay. And then now I'm like an old professor, so I'm on committees and I go like, this person doing something a little bit different. It's okay. Like literally, I'm like, this is okay, right? So yeah, I mean, it's definitely about the time and the space to recognize the different kinds of ways, different perspectives create knowledge.
Now, that's a really good question, and because I am learning to be honest about mental and emotional health, like one, therapy helps for me to help remind me when I am overworked. And when I'm, when I'm working 80 hours a week, that who am I working for, right? Am I working for my institution? Am I working for myself? Am I working to fulfill others' expectations. So it's helped me process these things to find like some balance, and I'm also learning how to. So I am proud of what I've done as a children's book author. I eventually want to come back to it. Like I'm starting to miss it again because for a while I felt like I was done with it, but now I am hoping to come back. But it is kind of like I'm also learning how to be okay about like, okay, that part of my life is done. Now I can be like more of a community organizer, and I'm finding pleasure in that, and so I'm actually thrilled about like having now that I'm in an institution that has some like funding for the projects that I'm interested in doing. I am in a fortunate position. I'm also like tenured that I don't have to fulfill certain expectations for research. So I have more liberty to do like these public facing projects, and hopefully again like returning to creative work. But also I think like one goal I have is like supporting the work of others, through like hopefully like exhibits or collaborative projects and such. So I think for me it's been about like just like not also be overly tied to just one identity. Like if there's an opportunity, I'm like, ooh, let's give that a try, and see how that works. Now, having said that, though, like the thing I really am like in academia, I feel like I have at least like 5 different jobs. Like I'm teaching and I'm advising. I'm doing like all these. I'm on 5 committees that I'm like I'm in a meeting and I'm like, what am I even doing here? Like, what are we talking about? And I'm organizing events. So there's all these things, and I'm also learning to say, I like saying yes to things, and that's a problem. I'm learning to say no to things, but I'm also learning how to like choose things that I genuinely enjoy. So there are certain committees I cannot get out of, but then I'm also very careful about like, oh, this is a committee that I would like to be part of, So I'm trying to be more and again I say this because I have tenure and because I have resources. I am able to do these things, which I think as Julian was saying earlier, like may not be true for many in the profession, unfortunately. Yeah. I hope that answered your question.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think I could have done what I do if I hadn't been sheltered, in academia, to be honest. And I actually never thought I would end up in academia, just because painting is really not the best route to be a professor, frankly. And I finished painting, and then, my PhD was going to be on this heady thing about like the male gaze and museums. And, I think, God, I could have spent my academic career in really beautiful museums around the world. And then I ended up doing teaching in prisons, and it really, I was telling someone that when it's time to write your dissertation, your mantle, it'll just sort of settle on your shoulders and you can't escape it. And so I ended up writing about prisons, and then subsequently spent the next 25 years in really miserable, horrible towns, eating like at the gas station and interviewing people in prison, which I loved. And so, but that, I had this idea. Lara was asking, do you feel like an imposter? And, I had this PhD and I was doing this deep ethnographic qualitative research, and, that's how I'd been trained. And never thought, I always thought, oh, I've got to, do these articles and these top tier things, and God forbid anyone notices that I'm an artist and that I draw, but I drew every day. And at some point after I got tenure, I just thought, well, I really want to draw and not write this stuff anymore. I'm not interested in doing these deep ethnographies. And I do love the research for doing ethnographies. I just don't really want to write it up into these long, drawn-out books that 4 people, including not my mom, will read. And so, but seeing American Splendor, like I didn't really grow up reading comics, made me think, oh my God, I could do qualitative research and make comics out of it. And I can't believe that that's my life. And I remember going to my assistant dean at the time, who I really care deeply about, and I said, when I go up for full, which I had no idea would be like 2 decades later, my portfolio is going to be about comics. And he said, well, there's a lot of people that, do scholarship on comics. He talked about Corey. And I said, no, I'm going to make comics. And he was like, oh, I could literally see him trying to be like, I don't think that's going to work. But, and he basically said, if you can get an academic press to publish it, sure, it's legitimate. So I was like, all right, cool. If I can get any press to publish it, it will be amazing. But I feel really lucky because I've really had a really multidisciplinary life, and I was at an institution that was like, okay, well, you're a weirdo, so we're going to put you here, and now your work is this way, so now we're going to put you here. Like Dean Maxon was like, you're really not doing typical art ed work. What you're doing is really much more gender studies. And I was like, yes. So I don't know. I've just been really lucky. And I think I always tell people to follow your bliss because like you were saying, you get one life and how many hours in the world do you have? And, if you enjoy what you're doing, hopefully things will work out one way or the other. And there's a lot of ways to make a living in the world. I mean, I love being a professor, but I think I probably, would be just as happy doing a lot of different things. So I don't know, I always had this probably ridiculous notion that like my identity, you're not your job, like the Fight Club thing. So like, yeah. But I am my job, which is sad. So it's a fantasy that I'm not my job.
Well, I was going to...
Totally.
I was going to say, one reason that made me think of the question is it feels like an applied example of the research about labor exploitation and worker exploitation, and then you think about it in terms of your own life and your own position, which I think is really interesting. So a sort of related question is sharing that work, whether it's academic or creative. So there's great events like this where you can share it with the public, but then also I've talked to many academics, some of you who have said, you don't want to feel like you're locked into academia. So, which can be a bit niche or a bit not as public facing as we would want it to be sometimes. So I'm curious if through your varied experiences, you have any lessons or advice for those of us who want to focus on public-facing work, public humanities, or things that are very applied beyond academia.
I'm trying not to look at Julian.
I was going to say, we don't have to start with Julian.
I don't want to. I know. Because I don't want to pressure you in an interview first. Yeah, I could start.
Sure.
Let's be equitable and like, no, like that's a really good question because like, in my entire academic life, I was never encouraged to do any public-facing projects. Like I was trained to write an academic book that, and then everybody would say like, "Ooh, if you sell 500 copies, that's a bestseller," like, and I'm like, so why would I want to spend 8 years writing a book that very few people, that will just be like in a library, like then nobody will check it out like ever. So it was just like and it was kind of so I kind of had known of that contradiction, but had not yet been able, like for a while, had a hard time imagining what people meant by public-facing projects. So, I would just imagine like, I guess like a conference presentation, that's public-facing, but then your public still is kind of like the same kind of public. So now I'm, I was hired at NYU. The position was very, like explicit about hiring somebody who was interested in community-facing projects. And so that really like compelled me to kind of do work with communities. So I've been a lot more intentional about working with community organizers and activists. So like folks who don't consider themselves like academics and museums, libraries, of course, like K-12 educators, which has been so amazing for me because it was like a whole new world opened up. Again, like I had I had a very small, like, I was in a siloed, like, children's slit circle. And I felt like, it was very, like, again, like, it was like that kind of reaching out. But also what it was informing my work, because I felt like, I had also thankfully been taught by others, like, when you work with a community, you don't take what you need and then leave the community, right? So that also has been in the foreground of my thinking. And what so the thing, I guess, like, one of the just before I transitioned to NYU, I read my colleague, and I advertise this because it's such a fantastic book. So my colleague at the College of Staten Island, Matt Brim, wrote a book called Poor Queer Studies. And one of the concepts that he starts exploring in that book, and then he later explores further in an edited collection, is the concept of queer sharing, where it's like institutions that have power and wealth, how do we using models of like queer communities where they share, like using mutual aid and commoning to share resources and support one another. Like how do we use that as a model in academia? So for those of us who are in power in more like well-funded institutions, can help like institutions that do not have funding. So that has really been like important to the way that I've been thinking about like. So in other words, I'm like divert expenses. Like I'm imagining myself as kind of like Robin Hood, like throw money to all these other places. So that has been in what's informing a lot of the public facing work that I'm doing. Mm-hmm. Where should I look? Seriously.
I think obviously for me, I had a lot of experience with community engagement pedagogy. That was one of the ways that, from my history background, working with the local history society, working with heritage communities in particular, doing things like oral history, those became the ways that, from a kind of history perspective, that you got involved in the community. And really the questions around how to make sure, let's be honest, as a person of color, there's always a certain amount of like fetishization when you're in an apartment, right? Like it's not like there's 1,000 Black people in an apartment, right? And so I always like to point out, if people ask me, I'm not an African Americanist, like not even a little, like I'm an urbanist at best. And Black people live in the city, but I'm an African Americanist, right? Like it's not. But when, academics and institutions look at you like, oh, you're Black, could you go talk to the Black people? Literally sometimes, metaphorically a lot of times. And you sort of have to manage that as an academic. So that process of managing that and trying to be mindful of some of the broader structural issues that come from that. When I work with communities of color in particular, a lot of times they don't want to come to the campus, right? They have really complicated relationships with institutions. And so they are looking for, one, they're always like shocked you work at that place. That's always like one of the narratives, especially early on in my career. I'm like, oh yeah, I work at the school. And like, we didn't think any Black people worked at the school, and so stuff like that. And so, you just I think you have to sort of work on creating a kind of infrastructure for yourself that's sustainable. It depends on the size of the institution that you're at. Like, I work at MSU now, and so of course, like I have the same sort of thing where like, what are the kind of partnerships that you can have that help, smaller organizations or smaller institutions? Like we're always thinking about, like, ironically, when we write grants, can we partner with the HBCU, or is there what other kind of partnerships can we have in this grant? Because they write grants all the time. Like, okay, I know this person at HBCU, let's get them on the ground, things like that. Which is a different scale from when you're like working in a small school and you're just like, I have $500, right? So it's very different. So those are things that I think you have to sort of balance out because, like, yeah, I do recognize that if you're, again, in academia, if you do community-based work, there's a danger that work can be marginalized by people in a certain way. And so you kind of have to create like an infrastructure to talk about the work as a part of a kind of scholarly narrative. And that was something I had to figure out talking to people. And there are great organizations that you can, point people to. And like now I can point people to like something like Imagining America or, but even then, this is really inside baseball, but sometimes when you're reading the tenure promotion guidelines for a department, they're very particular about where you publish. They have this language that you have to publish in a disciplinary journal. But when you do interdisciplinary work, the places you know publishing are interdisciplinary journals. And if you got, somewhat of questionable personality in your department, that can be a huge issue because that person didn't publish X, right? Yeah. And so there's this thing where the normal sort of review and professionalization narratives, you kind of have to check in with the people to make sure the work that you're doing makes sense in their head. As much as I would love to tell graduate students, yeah, you can do whatever you want. And we have a lot of graduate students at MSU, and they always come in with this idea, I don't want to be an academic like a normal academic. I want to be like a special academic. And I'm like, you did not join a rebellion. You joined the empire. I just want to be real with you, right? You are not Luke Skywalker. You are a stormtrooper. You're trying to be a better stormtrooper, someone that can hit something, but you're still a stormtrooper. So, you really need to deliver on, X, Y, and Z. And then once you're in, you can make changes. Clearly I'm not normal, so, hey, I survived. But, yeah, I survived. You don't know the people who they tried to do something and they didn't make it, right? And so there's, this balancing act. I'm always trying to intuit to them it's real because there are structures that we're trying to change and it's an ongoing process. Every person matters in that, that conversation.
Matt, I would say I started doing community engagement work just because I had this real moment where I'd been working with women. I worked with women at the same prison for 2 decades, and I was doing research, telling stories with them, this, that, and the other, and published another thing, and I thought, well, one, no one's going to read this, and they certainly will never read this, and it does absolutely nothing to change the prison industrial complex. Rome is burning, and here I am writing this 20-page article, and I thought, well, this is stupid and unpleasurable for me. I did not get any joy out of doing that. And so, I really did try to think, what kind of work can we do? And I say we because my students played a huge role in the work I did in prisons to really transform what's happening in that prison. Because you can be an abolitionist and talk about those things, but there are people that are living it right now, and you can't do that and ignore their living conditions. And so, and going in and out is really important just to bear witness, if nothing else. But I think, making a conscious decision to do work that I felt had some impact, on that system, in that system, with people deeply affected by that system, has really become, important to me. And I think a lot of artists work for free. And it's not because they're suckers. It's just because, when I think about what I can contribute, I'm I love people and I'm extroverted and I love to teach and talk and stuff, but I'm not a movement leader kind of person. I'm too old now to hang out and march in the rain. I'm you 20-year-olds should be doing that. It's not for me anymore. But I can make art and I can help other people make art about what is happening. And that's really, that's the thing I can do. So I don't know. I think I have a lot of complicated feelings and thoughts about community engagement and academia and, what it means. And I always feel in academia, no matter how shitty the institution is, we are always in a position of privilege, deep privilege. In Iowa, I think, the median income in Iowa is $42,000 a year, and people are doing really hard stuff. They're cutting up cold chickens. And here I am. I think it's really important to think about what can you do? How does it make your community better? How does it bring attention to certain issues? And then how does it actually make the lives of actual people better, and what can you contribute, and should you be in that space, and who else should be, and if you shouldn't be in that space, who can you bring into that space? How can you use your connections to bring people into that space who are better qualified and who really have something even more deep to contribute? So.
Great. So I will ask sort of one more wrap-up question, and then we will go to audience questions. So we'll pass the mic around again. So just sort of as a closing thought, we're the people who are here today. Many of us are scholars at the university. Some of us are artists. Some of us are comic fans. Sorry?
You make comics. You haven't even said that.
I do. Thank you for plugging my things. Your check will come in the mail.
Speaking of plugs.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. You can find me on Webtoons at Pop Jump Comics.
Seriously, no, for real.
Well, thank you. Your checks will come in the mail. So, I was wondering, as sort of the closing thought, we're in various roles here: scholars, artists, audiences, and everything. Do you have thoughts about what we can do in those sort of daily lives roles to promote these sort of the recovery of these counter narratives? Talking about moving away from these Eurocentric discourses just in our lives as media consumers. Do you have lessons or thoughts you think we should take away?
Can I take this one just to
Yeah, we can
start?
start with Rachel.
Yeah, it is your turn.
Yeah.
I think as academics, we have a tremendous amount of power to decolonize our syllabi, to have people and students and their parents and the communities in which the students are in to bring attention to things, and I think that is a place of power to speak from and authority to say, here's what matters, and to make that clear. So when you talk about what are you asking students to read? Who are you asking students to read? Why are you asking students to read that? Are they going to remember that and carry that forward? And how will that really change, who they are? We can mold them. But I think as academics and teachers, we have a tremendous amount of power and authority to make those changes. And that's like the upside of academia.
Yeah.
That's not a good thing, right?
No,
It's like,
I'm thinking,
really.
No, so, sorry, Matt, I was just like, I started like floating into space.
It's complicated. It's super
Could
complicated.
you repeat like the tail end of the question?
Yes, of course. So, as scholars or audience members of media in general, are there lessons you think we could take away for our daily lives?
So a couple of things as just to piggyback on what Rachel was saying. Like so for example, I also consider myself a teacher. Like that's my favorite part of my job, and so I've been paying so much attention to how I behave in the classroom, and like Rachel, I'm also an abolitionist, and grading is a punitive practice, right? So even that I've gotten rid of grades in my classroom. So like even small things like that, and to remind me of how, because again, I consider teaching to be like my main love in the profession. That's where I've had to do a lot of most of my work, kind of like unlearning, to kind of like become like I guess like to share power with my students, right? That's the best place I've been able to practice like sharing power. But the other thing too, actually, like I was so excited by Julian's presentation, and actually like hearing about your work with women who are incarcerated, like it's like allowing communities to also tell their own stories. I think because I think we often there's so much like romance behind like being picked up by a major publisher, and I keep thinking about like I think we should as scholars like really kind of like recenter, like give more attention to the various ways that publics are already creating narratives, and not kind of like give priority to the ones that are published in mainstream industries and that are given like these traditional awards, because I think there is that room, like I still fall for that, like kind of like, oh my god, like the dream of getting an agent and getting like, I don't know, published by Knopf or something like that. And I'm like, no, like maybe like, yeah, let's teach children to create their own comics, and like, you know, that for me is exciting. And I think that's something I would really love to kind of like support further in my future work.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think for a professor, I would say engaging with the public or like sharing your knowledge is probably really important, especially now. So, you know, there are websites like Help a Reporter Out. Have you ever heard of this? This is a website called Harrow. It's called Help a Reporter Out. And then, and reporters will post things where they're looking for experts. And so you can like answer, and you're like, I'm a source. And part of the reason I say that is because, like, you know, I remember one of the things that has sort of pushed me towards, like, you know, quote unquote public scholarship is like I would see someone on the news, I'm like, you are not an expert in anything. How did you get on the news, right? Like saying this stuff I know is wrong, right? Like that. I was like, oh my God. So I'm like, I will return a reporter's call. 'Cause like the danger, you know, and especially I feel like it's gotten worse over time. Like the danger of what happens if like they get the wrong person. Like, oh my God. So I always have colleagues like, I don't want to talk to reporters because I'll talk to them for 30 minutes and they'll misquote me. I'm like, and I've talked to reporters for like an hour and it came down to like, but you know, at least I can be assured that I try my best in terms of the information. For the public though, I mean, as a citizen, you know, it's crazy to see. I would be like, try to use more than one browser, right? Like, try to use a browser like Opera, or try to scan the web in incognito mode a little bit more, just so you can see the way the algorithm is shaping your worldview, right? Like, I talked to students about this. I'm like, the reason things are free is because you're the thing that's being monetized, right? So, like, a lot of the news that we get is based on triggering. Right? It's based on this headline makes you feel a certain way. I want you to click, right? So that is not conducive in any way, shape, or form to you making great decisions because like it's designed to make you very upset, right? So I mean, I have like so many browsers on my computer. I got Opera, you know, I have like different kind of like just so sometimes I can discern the differences. That's the other thing. Most students can't discern anything. They don't have information literacy. Like this is a huge thing we probably need to do more with at school when they're really young. But, you know, as a consumer, supporting local media actually is super important. As crazy as that may sound, in part because those narratives are narratives that you are more likely to understand and be able to contextualize. Like much of the narratives that drive some of our most tremendous or anxiety-driven thoughts are about abstractions that, if they were more contextualized locally, you would not be able to like so easily ingest them. Like there would be too much information that you could check in your own experience to believe them outright. So, you know, and then when it comes to institutions, you know, support institutions that you know are dedicated to public knowledge, like, you know, support your local library, right? I was a huge library kid. Like I went to the library all the time as a kid, like, you know, support the PBS because it's trying to provide you a kind of information. Like, I think, you know, there are things that we do depending on our positionality that do matter. But like, yeah, as crazy as those things sound, I would be like, think about if you're a professor actually talking to a reporter.
Great. All right. Thank you so much. So now we have time for some audience questions. We can pass the mic around again. So if anyone has questions for any of our panelists. Do we have the mic? Oh, we found the mic.
you broke it.
So this question is mostly for Julian, but anyone who feels like they have something to contribute, please feel free to hop in, especially if you want to save him from having to speak more. It's just a lot of what you've said, not like is the content of your talk, but a lot of these asides that you've gotten into sort of center digital existence, like
Right.
the fact that we have to constitute our existence partially in person and partially online.
Right.
And our students also like are learning to constitute their existence partially in person and partially online. This event is attended in person and also streamed online. We're being surveilled constantly.
Right. Yeah.
I am interested, like, to know how it is that you manage and navigate that tension in life, but also in the classroom when you're trying to teach things like information literacy. When you're trying to teach media literacy, especially, which I know like is incredibly important, especially if you're teaching comics of any kind. How do you like train people? How have you trained yourself to like see and interpret images in this context that is both like self-reflexive because you're seeing the image through a screen that the image has been delivered to you by an algorithm? Like, is there a way to do the sort of visual culture investigation that you learn to do in the context of comics and comic scholarship with like the visual culture that sort of just permeates everyday life now?
Yeah, I think we, in class, I talk to students a lot about looking more closely. Like I do a exercise in my my Afrofuturism class where I have people sketch, like and do like annotations, right? Like they'll look at an image and they got to translate the image, but they can only use like lines. I'm really getting it from Nick Sousanis, right? So he has this thing called grids and gestures. And what it does is just force people to like sort of translate what they're seeing, but not using words, right? So like it really gets them to like think about the connection. We do visual annotations, like, okay, you see this image, show me, write down everything that this image says to you, and then like in a second wave, I want you to try to make connections between the ideas that you've written down in this first wave after you've heard people talk about it. Are there ways that you can bridge ideas and things like that? We often, because of the nature of my assignments, a lot of my assignments in my class are making assignments. So it's like, okay, theoretically, and this is a thing where you have to spend the time building their capacity to understand, right? Like I teach a class on Afrofuturism, and like I tell them straight up, like, okay, you don't know post-colonial theory, so we're gonna learn some post-colonial theory words because everybody who's writing about this basically assumes you know post-colonial theory words, but you don't. And so like this is what discourse means. This is what agency means. Like this is what ambivalence is. like before we can actually get to like you looking at Black Panther. And so because if you don't do that, they're gonna be like, I just feel like you just said a bunch of stuff I don't understand. So like, building their capacity to understand things is a huge part of it. Talking to them about how the internet actually operates, right? When you're in a university setting, making clear the nature of the paywall. I mean, I put a lot of emphasis on open access, but I'm also really careful to recognize, these are the ways that you can discern where this information is coming from. .org means a different thing than .com, which means a different thing from .edu. Most of the web that you see is only like 10 to 15%, right? Like the rest of it is behind a paywall, and you have access to it as a college student, but you have to understand how to get at that information, right? Like as tedious as it can be, like, we have had conversations about Boolean searches and how they work. And so, those are just sort of basic things, but they understand technology in a way that is more complicated and also more strangely infantile than I think we understand, because they're all great consumers of technology, but they're not great creators of technology. And so part of the challenge of making is part of the sort of consequences of making is the challenge that creates is that it makes them see choices associated with the creation of something. And when they see choices associated with the creation of something, that is really a big transformation. Because then they know, like, oh, somebody did this. Like when we edit Wikipedia or we edit Wikidata or we do any kind of projects, and they see that there's somebody, there is somebody behind the curtain. Some faceless 30-year-old white guy, most likely, statistically speaking. But there is somebody, and like you can make these interventions, and it matters a lot. And so those are all the things that sort of come to the fore. I don't always know that any of that actually lands, though. Like I teach a class, and there are a lot of people in that class, and I look at them, and I'm like, nothing's happening there. And then later, like 2 semesters later, I get a random email. I really love that class, changed my life. Like, oh, okay, thanks. Thank you. Okay.
Anybody else? Thank you for your talks. And just a really quick follow-up question. So you're talking about having to introduce this terminology to students. And I keep, what I'm seeing in everybody's work is you're being interdisciplinary, working outside of academic publishing, is kind of pushing back against a way of making knowledge that is very, I'm not even quite sure. So unless we're using the language of academia, we can't be taken seriously, or right. We can't have any kind of an impact. And I keep feeling that that is what keeps any change from happening, because we're kind of stuck within this, just within a way of speaking and sharing ideas. And I'm just curious if this is something that you all have encountered or thought about in your work.
This seems like totally unrelated, but it's probably because it's my most recent thing that I experienced. So this is like a friend of mine, like my institution has like a goal to become carbon neutral, right? And I feel like that's a huge, like carbon neutral, but by 2040. And I'm like, I think the world will probably be dead by then, but okay. So my first question was, so I read the statement, on the front page, and I was like, where in this mentions fossil fuel divestments, which I think should be the priority. And so even that, like when I asked that question of a group. Nobody could answer it directly, and just like gave me a kind of like a statement that was buried, a statement by our president that was buried like a few pages in, and so that has made me think like, oh my gosh, so even in the face of a catastrophe, right? Like we're still kind of like imagining that what will save the world is like more solar panels on our roofs, instead of just like kind of like making these fundamental changes about even the way that we relate with one another. Because like, it's like, there's no change in like culture of traveling, the culture of like spending so much money on like food that goes to waste. Like no, there's no study of that. So I feel like, so what, like, I'm always thinking about like how slow things are, or there are certain things like that most folks are not willing to talk about. It's like so, for example, at the recent meeting, people were talking about like changes like that, and I just typed in the chat. I was like, yeah, we also have to question our relationship with like TIAA, because they like fund extractive industries and like land grabbers, and like only one person responded to it because it was like, oh, let's not talk about that, So, and I hope that I feel like it's kind of, I talk about this because it is like, I work on climate justice as well. So that's been a point of frustration. And the only thing that I've been able to do is like, in whatever platforms, I try to push and push and push and kind of keep talking about like, changing certain things. And I say that having flown here, I'm also aware of my own contradictions. So it's really difficult. It's really difficult. But thank you for that, because it's, again, forcing me to kind of like rethink my own priorities as well. Yeah.
I think your question about language is really interesting. And I actually think, I'll tell you a really fast story. So the first time I went to teach in a prison, I'd been teaching at a college, and I had this idea of what, a college professor should be like. And I was armed with my books and, all of my big words. And they were not picking up what I was putting down at all. And I was like, they're just going to leave. And I feel like an asshole. I mean, truly, that's kind of this moment. And so I really think that language is about relationships and really about communication. And like all of us have, like I kind of take this really evil pleasure in these words. You can almost, it's almost comical. You could almost be satirical about the buzzwords in academia. And, you can pick up any journal and you will begin to see this word and this word and this word. I mean, like we should make a list of 100 words we promise never to use, unpack, deconstruct, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it just goes on and on. And it's a turnoff. And it also inhibits your relationships with people. It inhibits communication. I think there's a real art to being able to plainly say in language that anyone is able to understand what you want to get across, And so I think there's great joy to me in language. I mean, I'm a deep reader. I love hard words. But I don't find any power in being able to, use those words with people that aren't really going to understand them and don't feel comfortable saying, I have no idea what the fuck you're saying. So I think that's really important, that using plain language. And academics really do create terrible distances between themselves and others and inhibit those relationships by using language, deploying it, which is another word I hate now, in ways that create those distance things and power and say, I know more than you do. It's nasty. So
You just mentioned all my favorite academic words.
I know. I'm like, I could just literally satirically write a terrible list of words we should never say anymore.
Every academic has like multiple publics, right? So in the sciences, the idea of the least publishable unit, the idea. There's probably a variation on that idea of like the mini publics, right? So the thing that you're producing for an academic audience can be for an academic audience, but the thing that you're producing for the public, and there is this sort of like magical space where like those things overlap, but even when they overlap, it's not all the public, right? One of the most oddly frustrating things I think for most academics is they can be highly lauded in one part of an institution for doing something that's public, but like scorned in another part of the institution, like the department for doing something that's public. And how does that work? Like, and part of the reason it works is that most institutions, regardless of their size, want to show that like the faculty who are working there actually matter in real world context, right? And that's not how the stuff that is your kind of academic stuff is actually, it's not actually sort of valued that way. It's like, can you talk to us in a way that lets us know that we deserve to talk to you? And so there's a huge dichotomy. And so what you end up having to always sort of keep in mind is the ways that those public conversations, those outputs, how can they overlap with your academic outputs? So sometimes it's just like taking some of the words out and just saying it in a different way, in a different format, right? I mean, I think that's part of the reason why podcasting is such a great format, right? Because you can talk to people and talk about something in a way that a normal person can follow. I think blogging or writing in a public forum can be super helpful. And even there's like these different stratas, right? Like there are certain platforms, departments and institutions understand more versus other platforms. So like if you write something for The Conversation, I think that usually gets a little bit more sort of like traction as opposed to you're just writing something on Substack or writing something on Medium. the irony, of course, is like almost everything that you do that's sort of like geared towards the public, more people will read it than will ever read the thing that you wrote is right for your academic thing. But you can't abandon an academic thing if you're academic, in part because part of the way that you matter in the public is because you're academic. Right? Like it's a weird, on the one hand, the limitation of the one thing creates this opportunity for you in the other's place. And then the strength of the other, of that thing creates this kind of weird opportunity in the academic space. Like, so if you are known and you can manage it, now it is really complicated because, like, you know, obviously there are stories that we can all tell about this, but don't try to tell the same story the same way every place. Tell the same story, just tell it differently for the different audiences. And, you know, have your sort of meta-narrative, because that is really important. No matter how many times, because I do digital humanities, right? And digital humanities is like the bastard child of every, like it's just very complicated. Like nobody knows what it is. And so every professional organization over the last 5-6 years has given their recommendation for people who do digital. And you can read through them, and they're all very detailed. But basically, at the end of every one of them, it says you need to prove to people that what you did was real. Like, it's basically what it says. I mean, it says it in really nice ways. It depends on which one it is, but basically, you need to make a case here, right? So it's like, at the end of the day, you're making a legend, right? You're telling a story, and that story has to have these different kind of permutations to it.
Okay, and I think that was the last question because time is up. But we can continue talking among ourselves. You can just approach our wonderful guests and continue the conversation. And now, our wonderful Rachel is gonna draw something for this seminar. So you are invited to just stay, and whatever she draws is gonna be projected on the screen, so you're gonna be able to see it if you want to, or if you